discovering new medicines, it's felt like for a long time kind of like throwing darts in the dark, right?
Yeah.
Just modify something that already exists and hope it
Yeah.
works. But what if we could really understand these disease-causing proteins, like really see their every move?
Yeah.
That's what this one company is trying to do, and it just so happens to be in an area, the global fight against cancer, that's worth like over $400 billion.
So it's a huge market, yeah. And that company we're diving into today is Relay Therapeutics.
Or
Ticker symbol RLAY. And they're a clinical stage company. They're laser focused on really developing precision medicines for oncology and genetic diseases. And their goal, it's not just to kind of tweak what we already have. They really want to rethink how we discover these small molecule drugs.
So for this deep dive, we've done a lot of research on Relay Therapeutics, and we're going to be talking about their business model, their leadership, their financials, really kind of getting to the core of what this company is all about.
Yeah, we're going to unpack all of that.
And we want to make sure that you understand this really important field and this company's potential without kind of getting too bogged down.
Yeah, we're going to try to give you the essential nuggets, the key takeaways.
Exactly. So the first part of this deep dive, we're going to break down their business, look at the key products, see what they're working on. Then we're going to evaluate the management team. And finally, we'll do a deep dive on their financial health. What kind of resources do they have to really pursue their goals?
And then in the second half, we'll get into the market sentiment around Relay Therapeutics. We'll look at who owns the company. And then finally, we'll do a risk assessment. We'll do a SWOT analysis.
So you can really understand their strengths, their weaknesses, where are the opportunities and the threats. And then to wrap it all up, we'll give you a final thought to kind of chew on. Something about the future of medicine development, something we didn't cover in the previous discussion.
Sounds good.
So let's jump right in. Let's talk about Relay Therapeutics' core business. What do they actually do?
So they develop small molecule drugs, but they do it with a really crucial difference.
Okay.
They're going after these proteins that have been really hard to target with traditional methods.
Interesting.
And their big innovation is this thing called the Dynamo platform, and it allows them to see and understand these targets in a level of detail that we've never seen before.
So that's interesting. So how does a company, and I know they're still in the clinical trial phase, but how does a company like that generate revenue?
So right now, their revenue is primarily from collaborations. They do a lot of licensing agreements with other pharmaceutical companies. So in 2023, fiscal year 2023, they reported $46.1 million in revenue. And the vast majority of that, almost 90%, came from these partnerships. The rest came from licensing their technology.
So they're really partnering to fuel their research.
Exactly.
That's great. So let's dive a little deeper into some of their key products and also this Dynamo platform. Tell me more about what they're working on.
Sure. So their lead candidate is this drug called RLY 4008. It's an oral small molecule, and it inhibits FGFR2.
Okay.
Which is a protein that's been implicated in a lot of different advanced cancers. And what's really interesting is that it's highly selective.
Okay.
So you can think of it as kind of like a highly specialized key for a specific lock, right?
I like that analogy.
So it's designed to target FGFR2 and kind of leave other similar proteins alone.
And does that reduce side effects?
Yes. Potentially, it can significantly reduce these side effects, like hyperphosphatemia, diarrhea. These are the things that often limit the effectiveness of other drugs in this class.
Got it. And what about the early data that we've seen clinically on RLY 4008?
So the early data that's coming out is really encouraging.
That's great.
It seems to be safe, it seems to be well tolerated, and it's showing these promising signs of actually shrinking tumors in a variety of cancers where FGFR2 is playing a role. So right now it's in a phase 1 trial, and the trial is really just designed to evaluate the safety, look at the pharmacokinetics, so basically how it moves through the body, and really importantly, look at its efficacy. How well does it actually work?
Excellent. So a selective FGFR2 inhibitor with some promising early data. What else is in the pipeline?
So another one that's really interesting is RLY 2608. This one's an allosteric inhibitor. Allosteric inhibitor of PI3-CoA. And allosteric is really the key word here.
Okay.
So instead of blocking the active site directly, it binds to a different location on the protein.
Interesting.
And this potentially allows for a much more fine-tuned control of the protein's activity. So imagine you have a speaker, right?
Yeah.
And you want to adjust the volume. You could go up and push the volume up button, or you could go to the back and turn the knob. And this is kind of like the knob approach.
I
This is
did.
a more fine-tuned approach. And 2608 is actually designed to target multiple mutant forms of PI3K, and it's selective for those mutant forms over the normal form.
Wow.
So it's being tested in clinical trials for metastatic breast cancer. And the hope is that it will be more effective and have fewer side effects than some of the PI3K inhibitors that are already out there.
So it's a more subtle approach.
Much more subtle.
But it's really targeted,
Exactly.
aiming for better outcomes. Now, there's also GDC 1971, I believe. Is that correct?
Yes. So GDC 1971 is an oral small molecule inhibitor of SHP2. And what makes this one really noteworthy is that it's a collaboration with Genentech. So it's being studied in combination with a whole slew of other cancer therapies.
Wow.
There's a KRAS inhibitor, there's an immune checkpoint inhibitor called Tecentriq, and an EGFR inhibitor called Tagrisso.
So they're trying to find the right combination.
Exactly. They're trying to see if by inhibiting SHP2, they can make some of these other drugs work even better.
It's like, finding the right tools to address a complex problem.
Yeah.
Now, I also saw another candidate, RLY 5836. Is that right?
Yeah, so 5836 is another potential therapeutic candidate that they have. It's still in early development, so there aren't a lot of details publicly available yet.
Okay. So we have a pipeline with a lot of interesting programs. But really what underpins all of this is this Dynamo platform. You talked about it a little earlier, but I think it deserves a little more attention. Can you paint a clearer picture of what makes it so innovative and how it all works?
Sure. So the Dynamo platform it's really at the heart of their unique approach. It's this integrated system that uses all of these cutting-edge computational techniques along with really rigorous experimental validation to just deeply understand these drug targets at the protein level.
Okay.
So they're using advanced machine learning to really analyze the way that these proteins move and predict how drug molecules might interact with them.
And I remember you used an analogy earlier. You talked about HD movies versus black and white photos. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So traditional drug discovery, a lot of times they rely on these static images of a protein structure. It's kind of like a snapshot.
Photograph, yeah.
Exactly, a photograph. But with Dynamo, because they have all this computational power, they can create this dynamic picture. It's more like a movie.
Wow.
And you can see the protein in action. It folds, it flexes, it changes shape. And this is really important because a lot of drugs will bind to a specific shape,
Right.
a specific transient conformation. And by visualizing this motion, Relay Therapeutics can design drugs that are much more likely to hit the right target at the right time in the right way.
So it's really reducing the guesswork
Exactly.
in drug design, which can save years of development and increase the odds of success.
Absolutely.
Wow, that's incredible. So let's zoom out a little bit now. Let's look at the bigger picture. How would you describe the oncology market that Relay Therapeutics is operating in?
Well, it's a massive market, and it's growing at a really rapid pace. So in 2023, it was valued at around $196.4 billion.
That's huge.
And it's projected to be worth over $400 billion by 2029. So that's like an annual growth rate of almost 13%.
So it's a rapidly growing market.
Rapidly. And unfortunately, a big driver of this is the increasing global incidence of cancer.
Right.
So by 2040, the estimates are that we'll be seeing almost 30 million new cases a year and over 16 million deaths annually.
Those are some sobering figures.
They really are. But on a more hopeful note, we're also seeing just amazing progress being made in cancer treatment technology.
Yeah, it seems like we're making great strides.
Yeah.
So targeted therapies, immunotherapy.
Yeah, all these are really coming to the forefront.
Yeah, personalized medicine.
Absolutely. And even the regulatory landscape has been very active. Between 2017 and 2022, the FDA approved over 160 new cancer drugs.
Oh.
So that shows you how much innovation is happening in this space.
So huge market, growing rapidly. Are there any significant headwinds that we should be aware of in this market?
Oh, absolutely. So one major challenge that all pharmaceutical companies face is loss of exclusivity.
Right.
When patents expire.
You get the generics coming in.
Exactly. And that opens the door to all these cheaper generic versions of their drugs, which can really cut into their profits.
Makes sense.
And then the other big challenge is just the cost of developing these cancer drugs. It is astronomically high.
Yeah.
So researching them, developing them, getting them approved, all of that is incredibly expensive.
And it raises issues of pricing and access for patients.
Absolutely.
It's a difficult problem.
Yeah.
So given this competitive landscape, this challenging environment, what advantages does Relay Therapeutics bring to the table? Who are their main competitors?
So they are definitely in a very competitive space. They're up against these pharmaceutical giants like Merck, AstraZeneca, but they're also competing with these smaller biotech companies like Scorpion Therapeutics, which is now part of Eli Lilly and Encore.
Okay.
But Relay does have some key competitive advantages. Their main strength really lies in this allosteric drug discovery approach,
Right.
which is really enabled by this Dynamo platform.
And that allows them to have more precise targeting.
Exactly. And then they also have these really sophisticated computational techniques. They're using machine learning to analyze protein dynamics. And this is really powerful for drug design because they can build these models that predict how the drug is going to interact with the protein.
And that saves them time and money in the long run.
Exactly. And that's really what they're betting on, that this approach is going to give them an edge over some of the more traditional drug development methods.
Yeah, it's a very different approach.
Very different.
So now let's talk about the people leading Relay Therapeutics. What can you tell us about the management team?
So the management team at Relay seems to be very experienced.
Okay.
They have a lot of experience in the biopharmaceutical industry, and they really seem to be committed to innovation, collaboration. They really value scientific rigor, and most importantly, they have a patient-centric focus.
That's great.
And this really seems to be reflected in their culture. They really emphasize teamwork. They emphasize respect, open communication. So it seems like a really good environment to be doing this kind of cutting-edge research.
So it's the kind of environment that you would want for scientific breakthroughs.
Absolutely.
Now, they're a relatively young company, so are there any potential leadership challenges that you think we should consider?
Well, they were founded in 2015.
Okay.
So they do have a more limited track record compared to some of the bigger, more established companies.
Right.
And, while they have these impressive backgrounds, individually, they haven't really had to navigate a major drug failure or a major market downturn. So in that sense, their leadership is still kind of untested in the real crucible of the market.
Yeah, that's a good point. They're still kind of figuring it out as they go along.
Exactly.
Working through those growing pains. So how have they been securing the financial resources to fuel their ambitions? Where's the money coming from?
So they've been using a mix of funding strategies. They've had some private investment rounds. They've done some public offerings of stock. And then, of course, they have those upfront payments and milestone payments from their collaboration agreements.
Right.
And they've been putting a lot of that money back into their core operations,
Okay.
particularly R&D, so research and development.
Makes sense.
And one really strategic move that they made was in 2021 when they acquired ZBAI for $85 million.
And what was the thinking behind that?
So they bought ZBAI to really strengthen their Dynamo platform.
Okay.
So ZBAI had a really large library of experimental data, and they had some validated machine learning models. And they also brought on a whole team of experts in applying machine learning to drug discovery.
So it was really a way to just boost their technological capabilities.
Exactly. It was a really smart acquisition.
Now, how about their investment in their employees?
So they seem to really value their employees.
Good.
They offer a really comprehensive benefits package. They have health insurance, dental, vision, life insurance, FSAs, and they also have these well-being programs. They have a fitness reimbursement program, an EAP. So they really seem to understand that their people are their most valuable asset.
That's great to hear. All right, so we've talked about the leadership team. We've talked about how they're funding their operations. Let's get into the nitty-gritty of the financials now. What does their current financial health look like?
Sure. So it's really important to remember that Relay Therapeutics is pre-revenue.
Right.
So they're not actually selling any products on the market yet, so they're still operating at a net loss, which is pretty typical for a company in this stage. They're investing heavily in research and development. But as of the end of 2024, they had a pretty strong cash position.
Okay.
They had cash and cash equivalents and short-term investments totaling $781.3 million.
So they have a pretty significant runway.
Yeah, they have some breathing room.
What about the other key financial indicators?
So their market capitalization is around $586.55 million. And then their PE ratio, so their price to earnings ratio, is not applicable because they don't have any earnings yet.
Right.
And their revenue growth can be a little lumpy because a lot of it is tied to these milestone payments.
Mm.
And as you'd expect for a company in this phase, their profit margins are negative because they're spending so much money on R&D. But they do have a very low debt to equity ratio, only around 6%, so that's a good sign. And their gross margin, when they actually do generate revenue, it's very high. It's almost 46%. So this suggests that if they can actually get their drugs to market, they have the potential to be very profitable.
So, substantial cash reserve, low debt, those are good signs of stability. However, a lot of their earnings are tied to these milestones. So do you think that that's a major concern for their long-term viability?
So those cash reserves are a great buffer. They give them some room to operate. But the reliance on milestone payments, it does introduce some uncertainty into their short-term financial performance.
Okay.
And, a low debt-to-equity ratio is great, but you have to remember, every clinical stage biotech company, they face these inherent financial risks.
Right.
The road from promising preclinical data to a commercially successful drug is a long one, and it's full of potential setbacks. There's no guarantee that they're going to get regulatory approval, which is absolutely essential for long-term revenue generation.
Right. That's the big hurdle that every drug developer has to clear.
Exactly.
So they have the money to operate right now, but their future success financially really depends on their drug pipeline.
Yeah, and their ability to maintain and build new partnerships.
Makes sense.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so we've covered a lot about the business, the leadership, the financials. Let's shift gears a little bit now. Let's talk about how the market is perceiving Relay Therapeutics. What's the sentiment like out there?
So right now, market sentiment seems to be kind of mixed.
Okay.
If you look at the analyst price targets for their stock, they range quite a bit. Some analysts have them as low as $12 a share, some as high as $30 a share, and the average is somewhere around $19.64.
So a pretty wide range.
Yeah.
Why such a big discrepancy?
Well, this is, biotech is inherently uncertain.
Okay.
There's a lot of scientific promise, but clinical trials can be disappointing. So there's a lot of risk baked into these companies.
Makes sense.
And recent news and events like, if they release new clinical trial data or if they announce a new partnership, that can really move the stock price.
Right.
So, it's a volatile space.
What about short interest in the stock? Does that tell us anything?
Yeah, so as of February 15th, 2025, the short interest was actually quite high.
Interesting.
About 15.79 million shares were shorted. That's almost 10% of the float.
Wow.
So that tells us that a lot of investors are betting that stock price is going to go down.
Right.
But it can also set up what's called a short squeeze,
Right.
where if there's some good news and the price starts to go up, the short sellers have to buy back the stock to cover their position, and that can actually push the price up even higher.
So it could go either way.
Exactly.
What about options activity? Does that give us any additional insights?
Yeah, so options activity seems to be kind of mirroring this mixed sentiment. We see some investors who are buying calls, which would profit if the price goes up, but we also see a lot of investors who are buying puts, which would protect them if the price goes down.
So it's really, people are hedging their bets.
Yeah, they're not sure which way it's going to go.
They're covering all their bases.
Yeah.
All right, so we have a mixed picture from the market. Analysts are divided, there's a lot of short interest, and options traders are hedging on both sides. So let's talk now about who owns Relay Therapeutics. What does the ownership structure look like?
So they have a pretty diverse ownership base.
Okay.
A lot of their shares are held by institutional investors.
Like big funds, pension funds.
Exactly. So
Okay.
some of their biggest shareholders are companies like SB Investment Advisors, Vanguard Group, BlackRock. These are all huge investment management firms.
Okay.
And this is pretty common for a biotech company.
Right.
But what's interesting is that insider ownership is pretty low. So the executives and the board members, they only own about 1.8% of the outstanding shares.
So the people running the company don't have a lot of skin in the game.
Not a huge amount.
Okay, so it's primarily owned by these institutional investors with relatively low insider ownership. Now, to bring all this information together, let's do that SWOT analysis.
Good.
What are Relay Therapeutics' strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats?
All right, let's start with their strength. So their biggest strength is, this innovative Dynamo platform. It gives them a real edge in drug discovery.
Okay.
They also have these really advanced computational techniques. And, financially, they're in a good position. They have a lot of cash on hand. And then they have a pretty experienced leadership team.
So strong technology, healthy financials, good leadership. What about their weaknesses?
So, they are a relatively young company and they have a limited operating history.
Right.
And they also depend on these collaborations for a significant portion of their revenue, which
Right.
can make their earnings a little volatile.
Right.
And then, even though the Dynamo platform is really innovative, it's still unproven in the sense that they haven't brought a drug to market yet.
It remains to be seen whether it can really deliver.
Exactly.
So what about opportunities? Where are the opportunities for growth?
Well, they're in a great market. The oncology market is huge and growing. There's a lot of unmet need.
And the need is only going to grow.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of potential for them to form new partnerships, maybe even be acquired by a larger company.
Right.
And then they could also expand beyond oncology and genetic diseases. There are lots of other areas where their technology could be applied.
So lots of avenues for growth.
A lot of options.
And lastly, what about threats? What are the main threats they face?
So they're in a very competitive industry. There are a lot of other companies developing cancer therapies.
Right.
And there's always the risk that their clinical trials will fail or that they won't get regulatory approval. And, they also depend on key personnel. If they lose some of their top scientists or executives, that could really hurt them.
Right.
And then finally, there are all these external threats. Changes in healthcare policy like the Inflation Reduction Act.
Right.
That could really impact drug pricing.
And their profitability.
Exactly.
Okay, so a mix of internal and external threats that they have to navigate.
Right.
So let's wrap it up with a brief conclusion. What are your key takeaways from all of this?
Well, Relay Therapeutics, it's a company with a lot of potential. They could really transform drug discovery with their Dynamo platform, and they have a strong financial position. They're in a good market. But they also face the same challenges that all clinical stage biotechs face.
So the potential is there, but there's risk involved.
Absolutely.
Which is pretty typical for biotech.
Yeah, it's par for the course.
So what do you think their success is going to depend on?
I think their success really hinges on their clinical development. Can they get their drugs through trials and get them approved?
Right.
And then can they commercialize those drugs? Can they actually sell them?
Right.
And the external environment, particularly drug pricing regulations, that's going to play a huge role as well.
Absolutely.
So Relay Therapeutics is a really interesting company. I think there's a lot of potential upside. But, investors really need to weigh these risks carefully and do their own research. It's a promising approach, but it's a very risky industry.
Yeah, definitely not a stock for the faint of heart.
Definitely not.
So here's a final thought for our listeners to consider. We talked about Relay's reliance on computational power, on predictive modeling. So how do you think advancements in AI, in artificial general intelligence, how could that further revolutionize Relay's approach? And what kind of risks or maybe even ethical considerations might arise from this deep integration of AI into medicine?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating question. Where does AI fit into all of this?
Definitely something to think about. So if you enjoyed this deep dive on Relay Therapeutics, please subscribe to the Stock Analytics AI YouTube channel. We do lots of in-depth analyses on really interesting companies and technologies. And one quick reminder, this deep dive is just for informational purposes. This is not financial advice. And please be aware that AI was used in the research and the information that we presented today.
Yep, all the sources are linked in the description.
So thanks for tuning in. And we encourage you to continue exploring these ideas and to always think critically about the information that you encounter.
See you next time.